I thought I'd just clarify for you what my role is, seeing I'm the inaugural Inspector-General of Biosecurity, and I should have some epaulets, of course, with a title like that. This position was formally included in the Biosecurity Act, which 2015, which replaced the Quarantine Act 1908. Was long overdue for an upgrade, and it was brought into effect in June 2016, and I took up my job in July. And it's a 3-year appointment. When I took it up, or before I took it up, and when I took it up, I was very interested to read the actual role description in the Act. And the Act is remarkably silent. My job, as in a simple form, is to review aspects of the way the Commonwealth staff in the Department of Agriculture and Water Resources perform biosecurity functions, to decide what I'm going to review, and then to conduct my review program, and then to publish those reports on the internet. So it's a very open thing. I consult with the Secretary of the Department, I consult with the Minister in framing my program and in conducting or delivering the reviews, but I do not have to be approved to do that. So I have a lot of independence, and it is quite a scary idea that nobody else is approving what you do. So there's quite a bit of responsibility in selecting what to review. So initially, I elected to discuss issues with the department and look at broad systemic issues, and the first reviews that I selected were to look at incursions and interceptions of pests and diseases into Australia in the last 10 years. That was one review topic. To look at hitchhikers and contaminants that come in with vessels with cargo on containers that are not part of the actual quarantine cargo or cargo that might be subject to quarantine requirements, but come along for the ride. And that's my second one. The third one was a look at how we keep out invasive exotic mosquitoes that could spread dengue fever, yellow fever, Zika virus and chikungunya, because when I was framing the program, the Zika virus epidemic was moving around, and there were interceptions being undertaken at various airports. So I thought it would be useful to understand what was happening there, and that's done by the Department of Ag in concert with the Department of Health. And then the fourth topic that I selected was the looking at how the military actually apply Australia's biosecurity conditions when they are coming back from overseas deployment, or when overseas military are coming to Australia for any exercises or so on. And that is a pattern which is increasing. So that will be looking at how the military, how the department can ensure that these visiting or home military have both the commitment to our biosecurity system and then actually implement the necessary precautions. So I'm looking at, I immersed myself in what is happening at the border, because that is the Commonwealth's responsibility. Once diseases or pests get through the border, the primary responsibility, the first responsibility, is with the state under the Constitution. But of course, we have collaborative arrangements that mean that a national approach can be taken. But the Commonwealth's specific role is to stop things getting through where possible. And we have to accept that we can't stop everything. The tide is too great. We try to stop as much as possible, and there is a concept called the acceptable level of protection, which means that the risk is intended to be reduced to very low but not zero. And this is a rather elastic concept, because once a pest has arrived, the acceptable level of protection will have been deemed to have been insufficient, whereas before that it may well be considered to be sufficient. So it depends on how it's interpreted. And that acceptable level of protection is delivered by through the commodity pathways by looking at an import risk analysis and then setting import conditions that hopefully will prevent the various pests and diseases that commodity might bring in from actually entering the country. And then that has to be surrounded by all the operational practicalities of how you then implement those import conditions. What I've learned is that the Department of Agriculture has very sophisticated methods of looking at the pathways that are coming in. The broad types of pathways are things like the sea cargo containers, which really it's a way of managing hitchhiker pests, soil contamination that could bring all sorts of pathogens, and also misdeclaration of goods. So there might be goods of biosecurity concern which are not being declared. We get about 1.7 million consignments of sea cargo a year, and although that's a steady number, that can involve large numbers of containers in a single consignment. In some cases, these may have to be inspected, and many of them don't, of course. Many of them might contain things like furniture or furniture could contain wood pests, but there are processes in place to try to prevent that happening. So the levels of surveillance have to be matched to the risk of the particular commodity and the risk of the pathway. So in the case of sea cargo, for example, there is a sea container hygiene scheme that New Zealand and Australia participate in, looking at reducing the risk of things like giant African snails and some ants, tramp ants coming in from Pacific Islands, and trying to get more hygiene in the way the sea containers are managed when they're in places like Samoa or different Pacific Islands. And so again, if we can move the risk offshore, that keeps us safer. That's a hitchhiker example. We've got air cargo consignments, and the areas of real risk here, biosecurity, are perishable food and cut flowers, are just high volume and high risk areas. And non-commercial air cargo consignments last financial year were about 31 million. So they don't all get inspected. There's only a small percentage of those. You can imagine all sorts of non-commercial air freight that comes in doesn't have anything of biosecurity concern, but some does. So risk assessments, scientifically based, and then also random sampling of stuff, groups that are not inspected selectively are checked, and I think they find about 2% of non-compliance in that pathway. Oh, sorry, that was the sea containers. Sorry, it's 0.02 non-compliance in the non-commercial sector. So the rate of non-compliance is very low, fortunately. You've got commercial air cargo consignments. You've got about 2 million a year coming in, and there's again about half of 1% that are found to be non-compliant, and obviously then measures are taken to deal with it. Then you've got maritime pathway, and we have about 18,000 vessels coming to Australia every year, and the biosecurity issues of concern are insects that might be travelling, hitchhiking on those vessels, the mosquitoes, case in point, the Asian gypsy moth, which can lay big egg masses up in the masts where there's a bright light that attracts them if they're in the port in North Korea or southern Russia, and then they sail here and hatch out here and could spread here. So at certain seasons, the inspection might have to be done, even to involve people climbing up the masts and making sure that that's not an Asian gypsy moth nest. Extraordinary measures have to be gone to for different pests according to the biology. And then there are the ordinary thing. There are also bees that could come in on ships. There are rats, which was the original reason that the Quarantine Act was formed, was because plague was brought into Australia by rat-infested ships. So rats remain a perennial problem. Then we've got the travellers, and last financial year there were 19 million people who came in, entered Australia, and that was up by 1 million. The most seized things are meat and beef jerky and lots of various fruits, plants, seeds and vegetables. So they're all a big problem there. And then, of course, we have the international mail. There's about 140 million items that come in. A lot of that is letters, and some of that's decreasing. But there are the small packages of food that people send in, and that area is increasing. The biggest thing that's seized there is salami and sausage and beef jerky, and again seeds. Very easy to slip seeds through. The seeds can contain all sorts of viruses which can take off. They could be planted in someone's garden and then jump the fence, etc. Or there could be weeds, fruit and vegetables, tobacco and poultry meat. So they're the sorts of pressures that are on the border. Now the Commonwealth has the responsibility for dealing with this. There are very sophisticated systems for trying to focus the inspections and the management of these pests, but it's extraordinarily difficult to do everything. The quarantine measures that are set after an import risk assessment or by various policies have to be implemented by the foot soldiers who are out there in all weathers. Whether it's cars coming through from America and a new pest which came from China a few years ago, the brown marmorated stink bug I have learnt about, which I knew nothing about, and it came from China to the States, and then it inhabits, it gets into the engines of cars that are sitting on the wharf or sitting in a field waiting to be exported, and when it's cold over in America, they climb into the engine and they hibernate and they can't be seen, and then they might hatch when they're coming through the equator, and when the hold of the ship opens, out they want to march. And so now there are measures to even fumigate whole cars to prevent these sorts of things happening. So there are sophisticated risk responses that are developed. The results, it's many needles in many haystacks that the quarantine staff or the biosecurity staff are looking for, and once things come in, then there are the processes which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, of consultation with the state's emergency action, attempts at eradication, and then decisions about whether a pest can be eradicated or not. My overall summary is that I'm very impressed by the work that the department is doing. I'm looking at specific reviews. I meant to say that my review program has been disrupted, you may say, or reprioritised due to the outbreak of white spot in prawns and the suspension of prawn imports, and so I am looking at that as a review topic and engaging in that review at the moment. Thank you.